A woman they called unlovable took a bullet meant for the man who saw her worth. And in that single act of defiance, she shattered every cruel word ever spoken against her. This is the story of Rosalie Hartwell, a woman the world dismissed, and Wade Mercer, a killer searching for redemption on a dying Wyoming ranch. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens between these two broken souls will leave you breathless. The wind came first. It always did in Wyoming, whipping across the open grasslands like something angry, something that had nowhere else to go. Wade Mercer stood on the sagging porch of his mother's house, his house now, though it didn't feel like it belonged to anyone anymore, and watched the dust devils spiral across the empty fields. The wood beneath his boots groaned. Everything here groaned. The fence posts leaned like drunk men. The barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Even the sky looked tired, washed out to a pale nothing that made his eyes ache. He'd been back 3 months. 3 months since he'd buried his mother in the hard ground behind the cottonwood tree. 3 months of waking up to silence so thick it felt like drowning. 3 months of walking through rooms that still smelled like her, lavender soap and old coffee, and trying not to think about how he'd been gone when she needed him most. The war had taken 7 years of his life. The bounty hunting had taken another 8. And somewhere in all that blood and distance, he'd forgotten what home was supposed to feel like. Now he remembered. It felt like guilt. Wade turned away from the porch and walked toward the barn, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The horses nickered at him, 2 left out of the 6 his mother had kept. He'd sold the others because he couldn't afford to feed them, couldn't afford much of anything these days. The ranch was dying the same slow death as everything else out here, and he didn't have the energy to save it. Didn't have the energy to save much of anything anymore. He was reaching for a pitchfork when he heard it, the distant rumble of wheels on the road. Wade froze. Nobody came out this far unless they were lost or looking for trouble, and he wasn't in the mood for either. He stepped out of the barn and squinted toward the horizon. A stagecoach, dust trailing behind it like a funeral shroud. Wade's hand dropped instinctively to his hip, where his Colt had rested for 15 years. But the gun wasn't there. He'd stopped wearing it 2 weeks ago, tired of the weight, tired of what it represented. Still, old habits screamed at him as the coach grew larger, the horses laboring up the slight rise toward his property. It stopped 50 yards from the house. The driver, a lean man with a face like weathered leather, climbed down without a word and opened the passenger door. Wade waited, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides, and then she stepped out. A woman, younger than him by a good decade, maybe more, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, the fabric dusty and wrinkled from the journey. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a practical bun that had started to come loose. She was substantial. That was the word that came to mind. Not fragile, not delicate. Real. Solid. The kind of woman who looked like she could carry her own weight and then some. She looked terrified. The driver pulled a small trunk from the back of the coach and set it on the ground with a thud. "This is the Mercer Ranch?" he called out. Wade didn't move. "It is." "Then this is your stop, ma'am." The driver tipped his hat to the woman and climbed back onto his seat without another word. The coach turned in a wide circle and headed back the way it came, leaving the woman standing alone beside her trunk in the middle of his dying ranch. She didn't look at Wade. Not at first. She stared down at her hands, twisting them together like she was trying to wring the fear out of her fingers. When she finally lifted her eyes, there was something in them that hit Wade harder than any bullet ever had. Resignation. Like she'd already accepted that whatever came next was going to be bad, and she was just bracing for it. "You Wade Mercer?" Her voice was softer than he expected. Cultured. Eastern, maybe. Educated. "I am. Then I'm—" She swallowed hard. "I'm Rosalie Hartwell. Your wife." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Wade stared at her. "My what?" "Your wife." She said it again, firmer this time, though her hands were still shaking. "The arrangement. The letters. I thought, didn't you?" "I didn't write any damn letters." Her face went pale. "But the advertisement. Someone—" She fumbled in her bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of newspaper, holding it out to him with trembling fingers. It said Wade Mercer, Wyoming Territory, seeking a wife for... Wade's stomach dropped. He knew exactly who had written that advertisement. His mother. 6 months before she died, when she'd still had enough strength to nag him about his future, she'd threatened to do exactly this. "You can't live alone forever, Wade," she'd said, her voice thin and brittle with sickness. "You need someone. This place needs someone." He'd laughed it off, told her he was fine, told her he didn't need anyone. Apparently she hadn't believed him. And now this woman, this stranger, was standing in his yard with her entire life packed into a single trunk, expecting to marry a man she'd never met. "Jesus," Wade muttered, running a hand over his face. "This is... I didn't know. I didn't..." "You didn't know." Rosalie's voice had gone flat, empty. "Of course you didn't." She bent down and picked up her trunk, tried to anyway. It was heavier than it looked, and she staggered under the weight of it. Wade moved without thinking, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. "Let me... I can manage." She jerked away from him, her eyes flashing with something hot and defensive. "I don't need your help." "Didn't say you did." Wade stepped back, holding up his hands. "But that trunk weighs damn near as much as you do, and you're going to hurt yourself trying to haul it alone." For a moment they just stood there, staring at each other. The wind picked up again, pulling strands of hair loose from Rosalie's bun and whipping them across her face. She brushed them away impatiently, and Wade saw it then. The bruise on her wrist. Faded, yellowish green, but still visible beneath the edge of her sleeve. Someone had grabbed her, hard. Something cold settled in Wade's chest. "Where'd you come from?" he asked quietly. "Pennsylvania." Rosalie's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Philadelphia." "Long way." "Yes." "And you came all this way to marry a stranger." She met his eyes then, and the look in them was so raw it hurt to see. "I came all this way," she said slowly, carefully, "because I had nowhere else to go." Wade felt something crack inside him, something he'd thought was already broken beyond repair. He picked up the trunk, ignoring her sharp intake of breath, and started toward the house. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "It's going to get cold soon." The house was worse inside than it looked from the outside. Rosalie stood just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the front room with barely concealed dismay. Dust coated every surface. Dishes were piled in the dry sink. The floor hadn't been swept in. Well, Wade couldn't remember the last time he'd swept it. His mother's rocking chair sat in the corner, a blanket still draped over the arm, like she'd just gotten up for a moment and would be right back. "I know it's not much," Wade said, setting her trunk down near the stairs. I've been meaning to clean." "It's fine." Rosalie's voice was tight, controlled, professional, like she was trying very hard not to react. "I've seen worse." Wade doubted that, but he didn't argue. He watched as she walked slowly through the room, her fingers trailing over the dusty table, the cold stove, the stack of unopened mail piled on the windowsill. She moved carefully, like she was afraid of taking up too much space, like she'd learned a long time ago to make herself smaller than she was. "There's 2 bedrooms upstairs," Wade said. "You can take either one. I'll sleep in the barn." She turned to face him, confusion flickering across her features. "The barn? You didn't come all this way to share a bed with a stranger," Wade said flatly. "And I'm not the kind of man who'd expect that. Take your time. Figure out what you want. If you decide this isn't for you, I'll pay for your passage back east." Rosalie stared at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "You'd send me back? If that's what you want." Just like that. Just like that. Something shifted in her expression. The tight, controlled mask slipped for just a second, and Wade saw the exhaustion underneath. The fear. The desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be another disaster. "I don't have money for passage," she said quietly. "I don't have money for anything. Everything I owned, I sold to afford the ticket here. If this doesn't work..." She trailed off, her hands twisting together again. "If this doesn't work, I have nothing to go back to." Wade felt that cold thing in his chest spread a little further. "Then we'll make it work," he said. "You don't even know me." "No, but you came all this way. That means something." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back furiously, lifting her chin. I'm not what you expected. I know that. Men always. She took a shaky breath. I'm not the kind of woman men want. I take up too much space. I'm difficult. You're tired, Wade interrupted. You've been traveling for weeks. You're standing in a stranger's house wondering if you made a mistake. And I'm standing here like an idiot instead of offering you something to eat. He gestured toward the kitchen. Sit down. I'll make coffee. I can make it. I know you can, but today I will. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rosalie sat. They didn't talk much that first night. Wade made coffee, burnt and bitter but hot, and found some bread that wasn't completely stale. Rosalie ate mechanically, like she'd forgotten what hunger felt like, and was only eating because it was expected. Her eyes kept drifting around the room, taking in the neglect, the decay, the evidence of a man who'd stopped caring about much of anything. When the sun started to set, Wade showed her upstairs to the larger bedroom, his mother's room, though he didn't say that. He'd stripped the bed weeks ago, unable to stand the sight of the blankets she'd died under, but there were clean sheets in the trunk at the foot of the bed. I'll bring up some water, he said. There's a basin in the corner. If you need anything else, I'll be fine. Rosalie stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. Thank you for not... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Wade nodded once and left, closing the door quietly behind him. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the soft sounds of her moving around the room. Unpacking, probably. Trying to make sense of this place, this situation, this life she'd walked into without any real choice. Then he went downstairs, grabbed a blanket from the parlor, and headed out to the barn. The horses shifted in their stalls as he entered, familiar and unconcerned. Wade climbed up into the hayloft, where he'd slept as a boy during hot summer nights, and spread the blanket over the loose hay. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. He lay back and stared up at the darkness, his mind churning. A wife. His mother had found him a wife. Even from the grave, she was still trying to save him. Wade closed his eyes and tried not to think about the bruise on Rosalie's wrist. Tried not to think about the fear in her eyes when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach. Tried not to think about the way she'd flinched when he'd moved toward her, like she'd been expecting a blow. Somewhere in Philadelphia there was a man, or men, who had taught her to expect violence, and now she was here, alone with another stranger, hoping for something better. The weight of that settled on Wade's chest like a stone. He'd killed men, good men and bad men, and men who probably fell somewhere in between. He'd done things in the war that still woke him up gasping in the middle of the night. He'd tracked bounties across 3 territories and brought them in dead more often than alive because it was easier that way. He was not a good man, but maybe, just maybe, he could be good enough not to hurt her. That would have to be enough. Rosalie didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the unfamiliar room and stared at the door, waiting for it to open. Waiting for Wade Mercer to change his mind. Waiting for him to decide that kindness was a game he'd been playing, and now it was time for the real work to begin. That's what men did. They lured you in with softness, with promises, with the illusion of safety, and then, when you'd let your guard down, when you'd started to believe maybe this time would be different, the door didn't open. Hours passed. The house settled around her, wood creaking and groaning in the cooling air. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the grass, a lonely sound that made her chest ache. She thought about her first husband, Thomas. God, she didn't want to think about Thomas. But the memories came anyway, sharp and cutting. The way he'd looked at her on their wedding day, not with love or even desire, but with resignation. Like he was marrying a burden. The way he'd told her on their wedding night that she should be grateful anyone had agreed to take her. The way he'd made her feel invisible, even when he was looking right at her. And then later, when the invisibility had turned to cruelty, Rosalie stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. No, she wasn't going to do this. She wasn't going to sit here and spiral into panic over things that were already done, already survived. Thomas was dead. Dead and buried in a pauper's grave because he'd gambled away everything they'd had and then drunk himself to death before he could face the consequences. She'd come west because staying east meant living with Thomas's family, meant listening to his mother tell her, again and again, that she'd driven him to drink, that she'd been too demanding, too difficult, too much, meant slowly disappearing until there was nothing left. So she'd answered the advertisement. She'd sold her grandmother's silver. She'd packed her trunk and climbed onto a westbound train with nothing but desperate hope and the knowledge that anywhere had to be better than Philadelphia. And now she was here, in Wyoming, in a stranger's house, married to a man she'd never met. Rosalie walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the stars were brighter than they'd ever been in the city, brighter and stranger and somehow more present, like she could reach up and touch them if she just tried hard enough. She wondered if Wade Mercer was out there somewhere, looking at the same stars. Wondered if he regretted letting her stay. Wondered how long it would take before he realized what everyone else eventually did, that she was too much trouble, too difficult, too much to be worth keeping. A tear slid down her cheek and she brushed it away angrily. Tomorrow. She'd think about it all tomorrow. Tonight she just needed to survive. Wade woke to the sound of someone moving around downstairs. For a disoriented moment, he thought it was his mother, thought he'd open his eyes and find himself back in his childhood, back before the war, back when the ranch was alive and thriving and full of purpose. Then reality crashed back in. His mother was dead, and there was a stranger in his house. He climbed down from the hayloft, every muscle protesting. Sleeping on hay wasn't as easy as it had been when he was 15. He was 35 now, and his body had collected enough scars and old injuries to remind him of that fact every morning. The sun was just starting to come up, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Wade walked toward the house slowly, giving Rosalie time to hear him coming. The last thing he wanted to do was startle her. The smell hit him when he was still 10 feet from the door. Coffee, real coffee, strong and dark and nothing like the burnt mess he'd made last night. He pushed open the door and stopped dead. The kitchen was clean, not just clean, transformed. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly on the shelf. The floor had been swept. The table had been scrubbed until the wood grain showed through decades of grime. And Rosalie stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, cooking something that smelled like heaven. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, and I thought, you didn't have to do this." "I know." She turned back to the stove, her shoulders tense. "But I'm not good at sitting still. And the kitchen was—" She trailed off, clearly trying to find a polite way to say it had been a disaster. Wade almost smiled. Almost. "It needed work," he admitted. "Thank you." Rosalie didn't respond, but some of the tension left her shoulders. Wade sat down at the table, his own table, in his own house, and yet somehow it felt different now. Less like a tomb, and more like a place where people actually lived. "Are you hungry?" Rosalie asked, still not looking at him. "I could eat." She brought over 2 plates, each loaded with eggs and thick slices of fried bread. Wade stared down at the food like it was something alien. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him, couldn't remember the last time he'd sat down to a real breakfast instead of just drinking coffee and calling it good enough. "Where'd you find eggs?" he asked. "The chickens." Rosalie sat down across from him, her movements careful and precise. "There are 6 of them in the coop behind the barn. They're half-starved and living in filth, but they're still laying. I cleaned out the coop this morning and fed them some cracked corn I found in the barn. They should produce more regularly now." Wade looked at her, really looked at her. She'd been here less than 24 hours, and she'd already done more work than he'd managed in 3 months. "You didn't have to do that either," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." Rosalie met his eyes, and there was something fierce in her gaze now, something determined. "If I'm going to be here, if we're going to try to make this work, then I need to be useful. I need to—" She took a breath. "I need to have a purpose. I can't just sit around and wait for you to decide whether or not you want to keep me. I'm not going to throw you out, Rosalie. You say that now. I mean it." She looked down at her plate, her jaw tight. Men always mean it until they don't. Wade felt something hot and angry stir in his chest, not at her, at whoever had taught her to expect betrayal as a given. "I'm not those men," he said. "I don't know you well enough to know what kind of man you are." "No," Wade agreed. You don't, but I'm asking you to give me time to prove it. Rosalie was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork and started eating, and Wade took that as answer enough. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who didn't know what to say yet, but were willing to sit together anyway. When they were finished, Rosalie stood and started clearing the dishes. Wade stopped her with a hand on her wrist, gentle, barely a touch, and she froze. I'll wash them, he said. You cooked. It's only fair. She stared at him like he'd just offered her the moon. You'd wash dishes? I know how. But she seemed genuinely confused. That's not... Men don't... This one does. Wade released her wrist and started gathering the plates. Go rest. You've been up since before dawn. Rosalie didn't move. She just stood there, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then very quietly she said, Thank you. Wade didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and turned to the sink. Behind him, he heard her footsteps moving toward the door, heard her pause, heard her take a breath like she wanted to say something else. But she didn't, and Wade didn't push. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Rosalie woke before dawn and worked until exhaustion forced her to stop. She attacked the neglect of the ranch like it was a personal enemy, scrubbing, mending, organizing, planting. The garden, which had been nothing but weeds and dead stalks, slowly came back to life under her hands. The chickens started laying more eggs. The front porch stopped groaning quite so loudly. Wade worked the fields and the fences, fixing what he could with the limited resources he had. He sold another horse. The decision made him sick, but they needed the money, and used the cash to buy seed and lumber and a few other necessities. They spoke in practical sentences. The west fence needs mending. I'll get to it tomorrow. We're low on coffee. I'll pick some up in town. They didn't talk about the advertisement. Didn't talk about why she'd come or why he'd let her stay. Didn't talk about the future or the past or anything that required more than surface-level honesty. But Wade noticed things. He noticed the way Rosalie flinched when he moved too quickly. Noticed how she always kept a table or a chair between them when they were in the same room. Noticed how she never asked him for anything, never complained, never expected comfort or kindness or even basic courtesy. Like she'd learned those things weren't for her. And he noticed the way she transformed the house. It wasn't just clean now. It was alive. Curtains appeared in the windows. Fresh flowers sat in a jar on the table. The smell of baking bread drifted through the rooms in the afternoon. His mother's rocking chair had been dusted and polished, and sometimes in the evening, Rosalie would sit in it with mending in her lap, her hands moving in steady, practiced rhythms. Wade found himself spending less time in the barn and more time on the porch, just watching her through the window. It should have felt intrusive. It should have felt wrong. But mostly it just felt peaceful, like maybe the house wasn't a tomb anymore. 3 weeks after Rosalie arrived, Wade went into town for supplies. Copper Creek wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a scattering of other buildings that serviced the ranchers and travelers passing through. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were noticed immediately. Wade tied his horse outside the general store and went inside, his list in hand. Coffee, flour, sugar, salt. Well, well. If it isn't the hermit of Mercer Ranch. Wade turned to find Samuel Brooks leaning against the counter, a smirk on his weathered face. Brooks owned the ranch to the south, a bigger spread, more successful, everything Wade's place wasn't. Brooks, Wade said flatly, heard you got yourself a wife. Brooks's smirk widened. From back east, they say. Mail-order bride. That true? Wade's jaw tightened. That's my business. Just curious. Brooks straightened up, his eyes gleaming with something mean. Heard she's not much to look at. Guess that's what you get when you order sight unseen, huh? The store went quiet. Wade very carefully set his list down on the counter. Then he turned to face Brooks fully, his expression cold and flat. You got something you want to say? He asked, his voice soft and dangerous. Brooks' smirk faltered. Just a little. Just enough to show he remembered exactly who he was talking to. Wade Mercer might not wear his gun anymore, might not hunt bounties anymore, but the reputation didn't fade just because the man tried to. No offense meant, Brooks said, raising his hands. Just making conversation. Then make it about something else. Brooks nodded and backed off, disappearing toward the back of the store. The other customers went back to their shopping, the tension dissipating slowly. Wade picked up his list and handed it to the clerk, who filled it without a word. But as he loaded the supplies onto his horse, Wade felt something dark and heavy settling in his chest. They were already talking about her, already judging her, already deciding she wasn't good enough. And Rosalie didn't even know. When Wade got back to the ranch, Rosalie was in the garden, her hands dirty and her face flushed from the sun. She looked up when he approached, shading her eyes. "How was town?" she asked. Wade hesitated. Then he said, "Fine." It was a lie. But it was also a kindness. Because what good would it do to tell her that people were already whispering about her, that they were already making assumptions and passing judgments based on nothing but rumors and cruelty? She'd find out eventually. Small towns didn't keep secrets. But for now, for today, he could let her have this. Let her believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could belong. "I got coffee," he said, unloading the supplies. "And flour, everything on the list." "Thank you." Rosalie stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I'm making stew tonight, if that's all right." "That's more than all right." She smiled. Just a small one, barely there. But it was real. And Wade realized with sudden clarity that he'd do just about anything to protect that smile, even if it meant standing between her and the whole damn world. That night, after dinner, Wade sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the empty fields. Rosalie was inside, cleaning up. He could hear the soft sounds of her moving around, the gentle clink of dishes, the quiet humming of a song he didn't recognize. It was such an ordinary sound, such a human sound. And it had been so long since this place had felt human. The door opened behind him, and Rosalie stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. "Do you mind if I sit?" she asked. "It's your porch, too." She sat in the rocking chair his mother had loved, the one he'd moved out here years ago so she could watch the sunset in her last months. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rosalie said very quietly, "Why are you being kind to me?" Wade looked at her. "Why wouldn't I be? Because you don't know me. Because I showed up on your doorstep uninvited. Because I'm not—" She stopped, her hands twisting in her lap. "Because I'm not what men want." "And you know what I want?" "No," she admitted, "but I know what men usually want, and I know I don't have it." Wade was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My mother used to tell me that the world had already beat enough kindness out of people. She said it was our job, those of us who still had any left, to be as kind as we could, as often as we could, to whoever crossed our path." He paused. "She was a better person than I'll ever be. But I figure the least I can do is try." Rosalie's eyes were shining in the fading light. "She sounds like she was wonderful," she said softly. "She was. I'm sorry you lost her." "Me too." They sat in silence after that, watching as the stars began to emerge one by one from the darkening sky. And for the first time since his mother died, Wade didn't feel quite so alone. Neither did Rosalie. And that, for now, was enough. The first snow came in early November, dusting the hills white before melting by noon. Wade watched it from the barn, his breath fogging in the cold air, and felt the familiar dread settle into his bones. Winter in Wyoming wasn't something you survived. It was something you endured. And this ranch, with its drafty walls and broken windows, wasn't ready for it. Neither was he. He'd been putting off the repairs for weeks, telling himself there was time, telling himself he'd get to it. But time had a way of running out when you weren't paying attention, and now the wind was already carrying that sharp bite that meant serious cold was coming. Wade walked back to the house, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Through the window, he could see Rosalie moving around the kitchen, her movements efficient and practiced. She'd been here almost 2 months now, and the transformation was complete. The house didn't just look lived in anymore, it looked cared for, loved even. He still slept in the barn. They still barely talked about anything that mattered, but something had shifted between them. Something quiet and fragile that neither of them wanted to name because naming it might break it. Wade pushed open the door and was immediately hit with the smell of baking bread and something savory simmering on the stove. Rosalie looked up from the pot she was stirring, her face flushed from the heat. "We need to talk about winter." Wade said without preamble. Rosalie's hand stilled. All right. The house isn't insulated well enough. There are gaps in the walls upstairs, and half the windows don't seal properly. When the real cold hits, and it will, those rooms are going to be uninhabitable. She set down the spoon carefully. What do you suggest? I can board up the upstairs for the season. We'll live down here, use the parlor as a bedroom if we have to. It'll be cramped, but it'll be warmer. Where will you sleep? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them wanted to address. I'll figure something out, Wade said. Rosalie's jaw tightened. You can't sleep in the barn all winter. You'll freeze to death. I've slept in worse conditions. That doesn't make it a good idea. She crossed her arms, and Wade recognized the stubborn set of her shoulders. He'd learned over the past 2 months that Rosalie had a spine made of iron when she decided to dig in about something. This is ridiculous. We're married, legally at least, and you're going to catch pneumonia sleeping in an unheated barn in the middle of a Wyoming winter because of some misguided sense of propriety. It's not about propriety. Then what is it about? Wade didn't have a good answer for that, or rather, he had several answers, and none of them were things he wanted to say out loud. It was about not wanting to make her uncomfortable, about not wanting to be another man who took up space in her life without asking permission, about the way she still flinched sometimes when he moved too quickly, and the bruise he'd seen on her wrist that first day, and the haunted look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. I don't want you to feel trapped, he said finally. Rosalie's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that, truly. But I'd rather feel uncomfortable than know you're freezing to death 50 yards away because you're trying to be noble. She paused. We're both adults. We can share a house without... She stopped, her cheeks flushing. We can manage. Wade studied her face, looking for signs of hesitation, of fear, of anything that said she was saying this because she thought she had to, rather than because she meant it. He didn't see any. All right, he said. We'll board up the upstairs. I'll sleep in the parlor. Fine. Fine. They stared at each other for a moment, and then Rosalie turned back to her pot, stirring with perhaps more force than necessary. Wade grabbed his coat and headed back outside before he could say something stupid. The next week was a blur of work. Wade boarded up the upstairs windows and sealed the gaps in the walls as best he could with what materials he had. He moved his few belongings into the parlor and set up a bedroll near the fireplace. Rosalie rearranged the downstairs, turning the small room off the kitchen into her sleeping space and organizing their supplies to make the most of the limited area. They were living on top of each other now. No barn to retreat to, no upstairs to provide distance. Every morning, Wade woke to the sound of Rosalie moving around the kitchen. Every evening, she sat in the rocking chair near his bedroll, mending or reading by lamplight while he pretended not to watch her. It should have been awkward. Somehow, it wasn't. The real cold hit in mid-November with a vengeance that took even Wade by surprise. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in the horse trough froze solid overnight. The wind howled around the house like something alive, searching for any crack, any weakness to exploit. Wade checked on the animals twice a day, breaking ice and hauling feed through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper. His hands cracked and bled from the cold despite the gloves. His chest ached from breathing air that felt like knives. And then the blizzard came. It started as a whisper of snow in the early afternoon, light and almost pretty. By evening, it was a white wall that erased the world beyond the front porch. By midnight, it was a screaming fury that shook the house and made the windows rattle in their frames. Wade stood at the window watching the storm with growing unease. He'd seen blizzards before, had survived more than his share. But this one felt different, meaner, like it had a personal grudge against anything stupid enough to be alive in Wyoming in November. How long will it last? Rosalie's voice came from behind him, quiet and steady. Hard to say. Could be a day. Could be 3. The animals? They'll be all right. The barn's solid, and they've got feed and water. It's us I'm worried about. Rosalie moved to stand beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. We have food, we have firewood, we'll be fine. Yeah, Wade agreed. But he didn't move away from the window. The storm raged all night and into the next day. Snow piled against the door until Wade had to shove it open with his shoulder just to check the depth. The world had disappeared, replaced by a whiteout so complete that he couldn't see the barn 30 yards away. They were trapped, completely and utterly cut off from everything beyond these walls. Wade had lived alone for months after his mother died, surrounded by silence and emptiness. But this was different. This was being sealed in a small space with another person, with nowhere to hide, nothing to distract from the reality of their situation. For the first time since Rosalie arrived, there was nothing to do but sit with each other and exist in the same space. It was terrifying. They spent the morning in careful silence, orbiting each other like planets afraid of collision. Wade fed the fire. Rosalie cooked. They ate without talking. The storm screamed outside, and inside the tension built like pressure in a sealed container. By afternoon, Wade couldn't take it anymore. "I need to check the barn," he announced, reaching for his coat. Rosalie looked up from her mending, her eyes sharp. "You can't go out in this." The horses are fine. You said so yourself." She set down her mending and stood, blocking his path to the door. "You're looking for an excuse to leave." Wade stopped, his coat half on. "I'm checking the animals." "You're running away." "I'm not." He bit off the denial because it was a lie, and they both knew it. "I'm not used to this." "To what?" "To being inside, to being around people, to—" He gestured helplessly at the space between them. "To this." Rosalie's expression softened slightly, but she didn't move from the door. "Neither am I," she said quietly. "But running into a blizzard isn't going to make it easier." "I'm not running. You've been running since I got here." Her voice wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. "Every time things get too close, too real, you find an excuse to leave. The barn, the fields, town. And now you want to risk freezing to death to check on animals that don't need checking, because sitting in the same room with me for a few hours is apparently worse than dying in a snowdrift." Wade felt like she'd punched him in the chest. "That's not, isn't it?" They stared at each other, the fire crackling between them, the wind howling its approval of the confrontation. Finally, Wade took off his coat and hung it back on the hook. "All right," he said. "We'll stay inside." Rosalie nodded and returned to her chair, picking up her mending with hands that shook just slightly. Wade sat down heavily on his bedroll and stared into the fire, feeling trapped and exposed and absolutely terrified of what came next. Because she was right. He had been running, and now there was nowhere left to go. The afternoon stretched into evening. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Wade tried to read, an old book of his mother's that he'd read 100 times before, but the words blurred together. Rosalie cooked dinner, and they ate in silence that felt heavier than before. After dinner, Wade couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you really come here?" he asked abruptly. Rosalie looked up from washing the dishes, her hands still in the water. "I told you, I had nowhere else to go." "That's not all of it." Quiet for a long moment. Then she dried her hands and came to sit in the rocking chair, her posture rigid, defensive. "No," she admitted, "it's not all of it." Wade waited. "My husband died 2 years ago," Rosalie said finally, her voice flat and emotionless. "Thomas, he wasn't a good man. But I was 20, and my parents were dead, and he was the only person who'd offered marriage, so I said yes." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "He made it very clear from the beginning that I was a disappointment, that he'd settled, that I should be grateful anyone had wanted me at all." Wade felt something hot and violent stir in his chest, but he kept his mouth shut and let her talk. "He drank," Rosalie continued, "and when he drank, he got mean. Never hit me, not with his fists anyway, but words can leave bruises too, can make you feel small and worthless, and like you're taking up too much space just by existing." Her voice cracked slightly. "When he died, I thought I'd finally be free. But his family blamed me, said I'd driven him to drink, said I'd been a burden he couldn't carry. They wanted me out of the house, out of their lives, out of sight." "So you came west?" "So I came west," she agreed. "I saw the advertisement, and I thought maybe out here where no one knew me, I could be someone different, someone useful, someone who mattered." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Stupid, right?" "No," Wade said quietly. "Not stupid." Rosalie looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you've worked harder in 2 months than I managed in 6. I know you took a house that was falling apart and made it a home again. I know you've never once complained or asked for anything you didn't earn. He paused. That's not nothing, Rosalie. She looked away, blinking rapidly. You're being kind again. I'm being honest. Men aren't usually honest with me. They're usually just disappointed. Wade felt that violent thing in his chest grow teeth. Then they were idiots. That startled a laugh out of her. A real one this time. You don't even know what I look like under all these layers. For all you know, I don't care what you look like under all those layers, Wade interrupted. I care that you're here, that you stayed, that you didn't run when you saw what a mess this place was. Rosalie met his eyes, and something passed between them, something raw and honest and terrifying in its intensity. Why didn't you send me away? She asked. That first day. You could have paid for my passage back and been done with me. Wade was quiet for a long time. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world, but inside, everything had gone still. Because you look scared, he said finally, and tired, and like you'd already survived more than anyone should have to. And I thought, he trailed off, searching for the right words. I thought maybe we could survive whatever came next a little better together than apart. Rosalie's breath caught. I've done terrible things, Wade continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. Killed men, good men and bad men. Saw things in the war that still wake me up at night. Spent 15 years hunting people for money and didn't much care whether they came in alive or dead because it was easier to haul a corpse than a prisoner. He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused and stained with old violence. I'm not a good man, Rosalie. I'm probably not even a decent man. But I looked at you standing there with your whole life in a trunk, and I thought maybe I could at least try not to be another person who hurt you. What? The silence that followed was so complete that Wade could hear his own heartbeat. Then Rosalie said, very softly, Do you know what I see when I look at you? Wade didn't answer. I see someone who gave me a room without asking for anything in return, who washed dishes because I cooked, who slept in a barn in the middle of fall because he didn't want me to feel pressured, who bought supplies we could barely afford so I could plant a garden. She paused. That's not a bad man, Wade. That's just a man who's been hurt and doesn't know how to stop bleeding yet. Wade felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding him together through sheer force of will for longer than he could remember. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice rough. I don't know how to be around people anymore. I don't know how to talk about things that matter. I spent so long alone that I forgot how to be anything else. Then we'll figure it out together, Rosalie said. Because I don't know how to do this either. I don't know how to trust that someone won't hurt me. I don't know how to believe I'm worth keeping around. I don't know how to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. They looked at each other across the small room, two people who'd been broken in different ways but somehow ended up in the same place, in the same storm, trying to make sense of what came next. I'm glad you're here, Wade said, and meant it. Rosalie smiled, a real smile this time, small and fragile but genuine. So am I. The storm raged for 3 more days, and during those 3 days, trapped in that small house with nowhere to hide, Wade and Rosalie started talking, really talking, not about practical things like supplies and chores and weather, about real things, hard things, things that hurt to say out loud. Wade told her about the war, about the boys he'd watched die in mud and blood and screaming chaos, about the way killing someone changed you, made you into something you didn't recognize in the mirror, about coming home to find everything different, everyone changed, and not knowing how to fit into the spaces that used to feel like home. Rosalie told him about her childhood, about losing her parents to typhoid when she was 17, about the relatives who took her in but made it clear she was a burden, about Thomas and his casual cruelty, the way he'd made her feel invisible even when he was looking right at her. They talked about loneliness, about what it felt like to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone, about the weight of other people's expectations and the impossibility of ever measuring up. And slowly, carefully, they started to talk about the future. What do you want? Wade asked on the 3rd night, both of them sitting by the fire, the storm finally starting to ease outside. Rosalie considered the question seriously. I want to matter, she said finally. I want to build something that lasts. I want to wake up in the morning and feel like my being here makes a difference. You already do that. She shook her head. I clean and cook and garden. That's not the same as mattering. Why not? Because those are things anyone could do. But no one else did, Wade pointed out. This place was dying before you got here, and now it's not. That's not nothing. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. What about you? What do you want? Wade stared into the fire, thinking. What did he want? He'd stopped wanting things years ago, had learned to survive on not expecting anything because expectations just led to disappointment. But now, I want to stop running, he said quietly. I want to wake up and not feel like I'm just waiting for the next disaster. I want... He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. What? Rosalie prompted gently. I want this to be enough, Wade finished. This house, this ranch, this... whatever this is between us. I want it to be enough to build a life on. Rosalie reached out, slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and solid and real. Wade didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching the fire burn down to embers. While outside, the storm finally began to break. When morning came, the world was transformed. Snow covered everything in smooth white drifts that sparkled in the weak sunlight. The sky was clear and impossibly blue. The silence was profound, not the oppressive silence of before, but something cleaner, peaceful. Wade stood on the porch, breathing in air so cold it hurt his lungs, and felt something shift inside him, something fundamental. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Behind him, the door opened and Rosalie stepped out, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her breath fogging in the frigid air. It's beautiful, she said softly. Yeah, Wade agreed. It is. They stood together, watching the sun climb higher, painting the snow gold and pink and orange. And when Rosalie's hand found his again, Wade held on tight. That night, for the first time since Rosalie arrived, Wade didn't retreat to his bedroll immediately after dinner. Instead, he sat in the chair near the fire while Rosalie settled into the rocking chair. And they talked about small things, easy things, the garden plans for spring, repairs that needed doing, whether they should try to get another horse or wait until the finances improved. It felt normal. It felt like home. And when exhaustion finally pulled at Wade's eyes and Rosalie stood to head to her room, she paused at the doorway. Wade? Yeah? Thank you for talking to me, for not running away. Wade met her eyes across the dim room. Thank you for making me stay. She smiled, and then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Wade lay down on his bedroll and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the small sounds of Rosalie getting ready for bed in the next room. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep without the nightmares waiting for him in the dark. The nightmares came anyway. They always did. But this time, when Wade jerked awake in the middle of the night, gasping and disoriented, there was a soft knock on his door. Wade, are you all right? He sat up, his heart still pounding. I'm fine, just a dream. The door opened a crack and Rosalie peered in, her hair loose around her shoulders, concern etched on her face. You don't sound fine. It's nothing. Go back to sleep. She hesitated, then stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. Do you want to talk about it? No. Do you want me to stay? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications and possibilities, and the kind of vulnerability that made Wade's chest ache. You don't have to, he said. I know. But do you want me to? Wade looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she stood there in her nightgown and shawl, brave and terrified all at once, offering comfort when she'd probably never received much herself. Yes, he admitted, I do. Rosalie crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside his bedroll, her back against the wall, keeping a careful distance between them. They didn't talk, didn't touch, just sat in the darkness together, breathing in rhythm, until Wade's heartbeat slowed and the shadows in his head retreated. Better? Rosalie asked eventually. Yeah, better. She started to stand, but Wade's voice stopped her. Rosalie? Yes? I'm glad you're here. In the darkness, he heard her breath catch. Then very softly, so am I. She went back to her room then, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed, some barrier lowered, and when Wade finally fell back asleep, It was with the knowledge that he wasn't facing the darkness alone anymore. Neither was Rosalie, and that made all the difference. Winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, like it resented having to give way to anything softer. By March, the snow had melted into mud that sucked at boots and turned every path into a treacherous mess. The fields emerged brown and lifeless, waiting for warmth that seemed like it might never come. But inside the house, something was blooming. Wade couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had shifted between them. Maybe it was that night during the blizzard, when they'd finally stopped pretending they were just two strangers sharing space. Maybe it was the morning he'd woken to find Rosalie asleep in the rocking chair beside his bedroll, a quilt pulled over her lap, like she'd meant to stay just a few minutes and ended up keeping watch all night. Maybe it was the afternoon he'd come in from mending fence to find her singing while she kneaded bread, her voice clear and unselfconscious, and he'd stood in the doorway for 10 minutes just listening. Whatever it was, they'd stopped orbiting each other like wary planets and started existing in the same space without all the careful distance. Wade moved back into the house properly once the worst of the cold passed. Not upstairs, those rooms were still sealed, but into the small room off the kitchen that Rosalie had been using. She'd moved her things into his mother's old room without asking, without making it into something that needed discussion, and he'd accepted the change without protest. They were learning each other's rhythms, learning when to talk and when to let silence do the work, learning how to share coffee in the morning without it feeling awkward, how to work side by side in the garden without constantly apologizing for being in each other's way. And Wade was learning that Rosalie's presence had become something he looked forward to instead of something he endured. He was still thinking about that particular revelation when the riders appeared on the horizon. It was early April, the kind of clear spring day that made you believe winter might actually be finished for real this time. Wade was working on the fence line, replacing rotted posts, when he caught the movement in the distance. 4 horses, coming fast, heading straight for the ranch. His gut clenched immediately. Nobody came out here unless they wanted something. And people who wanted something rarely came alone. Wade dropped the post he'd been working on and headed for the house at a pace just short of running. Rosalie was in the garden, her hands dirty from planting early peas, her face tilted toward the sun. "Inside," Wade called out. "Now!" She looked up, startled by the sharp edge in his voice. Then she saw his expression and didn't argue. Just stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and headed for the house. Wade followed her inside and went straight for the rifle mounted over the fireplace. It was old, had been his father's, but he kept it clean and loaded because this was Wyoming and you didn't survive out here by being unprepared. "What's wrong?" Rosalie asked, her voice steady despite the fear he could see creeping into her eyes. "Riders coming, 4 of them." "Do you know who they are?" "Not yet." Wade checked the rifle's action, then moved to the window. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out details. Well-dressed for traveling. Good horses. The kind of men who had money and weren't afraid to show it. The kind of men who usually meant trouble. They pulled up in front of the house in a cloud of dust, and Wade's hand tightened on the rifle. The man in front was tall, maybe 40, with dark hair slicked back and a suit that probably cost more than Wade made in 6 months. His face was sharp, fox-like, with eyes that assessed and calculated and found most things wanting. Wade didn't recognize him, but Rosalie did. He heard her sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the small sound of distress she couldn't quite suppress. "You know them?" Wade asked without turning around. "The one in front." Her voice had gone thin, terrified. "That's Vincent Crowley. He was my husband's cousin." Wade felt ice slide down his spine. "What's he doing here?" "I don't know, but nothing good." The riders dismounted, and Vincent Crowley walked up to the porch like he owned it. Wade opened the door before the man could knock, the rifle held loose in his hands, but unmistakably present. "Help you?" Wade asked flatly. Crowley's eyes flicked to the rifle, then back to Wade's face. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, I presume. I'm Vincent Crowley from Philadelphia. I'm here about my cousin's widow." "She's my wife now. Got the papers to prove it." "Ah, yes. The hasty marriage." Crowley's smile turned sharp. "How very convenient. Tell me, did she mention that she was already promised to someone else before she ran off west?" Wade felt Rosalie go rigid behind him. "That's a lie." Crowley pulled a folded document from his jacket and held it out. Is it? Because I have a signed contract right here, dated 6 months before your alleged marriage, promising Rosalie's hand to my associate in exchange for settling her late husband's considerable debts. He paused, letting that sink in. Debts that she incurred and is legally responsible for. I incurred nothing, Rosalie said, stepping forward, her voice shaking with fury. Thomas gambled away everything we had and then drank himself to death. I didn't sign anything. Your signature says otherwise. Crowley's eyes raked over her, and Wade saw the disgust there, the casual cruelty. Though I can't imagine why anyone would want you enough to pay for the privilege. Still, a contract is a contract, and you belong to someone else, Mrs. Hartwell. The name hit Rosalie like a slap. Not Mercer. Hartwell. Like the past months hadn't happened, like she was still that frightened woman climbing off a stagecoach with her life in a trunk. Wade stepped forward, putting himself between Crowley and Rosalie. I don't give a damn what papers you're waving around. She's my wife. She stays here. I'm afraid the law disagrees with you, Mr. Mercer. Crowley's voice was smooth, reasonable, the kind of tone that made Wade want to put a fist through his teeth. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to discuss compensation. Say $500, and we'll consider the contract fulfilled. You can keep your bride. $500. Wade didn't have $50. Didn't have $5 most weeks, and Crowley knew it. Could probably see it in the state of the ranch, in Wade's worn clothes, in every visible sign of struggle. Get off my land, Wade said quietly. I don't think you understand the situation. I understand fine. You're trying to extort money I don't have by threatening a woman who doesn't belong to you. That sound about right? Crowley's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. That woman cost my family a considerable amount of money. She's going to pay it back one way or another. Over my dead body. That can be arranged. The three men behind Crowley shifted, hands moving toward weapons they probably shouldn't have been carrying but definitely were. Wade raised the rifle slightly, not pointing it at anyone yet, but making it clear that could change real quick. You've got about 10 seconds to get back on those horses and ride out of here, Wade said. After that, I stopped being polite. Crowley studied him for a long moment, and Wade could see the calculation happening. 4 men against 1. Good odds, normally, but there was something in Wade's eyes, something left over from 15 years of violence, that gave even Crowley pause. This isn't over, Crowley said finally. I'll be back with a marshal, with proper legal authority, and then we'll see how brave you are. I'll be here. Crowley turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Rosalie. You know, I actually tried to help you after Thomas died. Tried to find you a situation, but you were always so ungrateful, so difficult. His lip curled. No wonder Thomas drank. Having to look at you every day, having to... Wade moved before he'd consciously decided to. The rifle came up, the barrel pointed directly at Crowley's chest. Finish that sentence, Wade said softly. Please. Crowley went pale. Behind him, his men reached for their guns, but froze when Wade's finger moved to the trigger. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Crowley forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Another time, Mr. Mercer. Another time. He walked back to his horse with measured dignity, but Wade could see the fear in the stiffness of his shoulders. The 4 men mounted and rode off, not quite running, but close enough. Wade didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared over the rise. When he finally turned around, Rosalie was standing in the doorway, her face white, her hands shaking. He's going to come back, she said. He's going to bring the law, and they're going to take me away, and... Wade set the rifle down and crossed to her in 2 long strides. He wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but he wasn't sure if that would help or make things worse. Nobody's taking you anywhere, he said. You don't know that. If he has papers, if there's really a contract, then the papers are fake. You said you didn't sign anything. I didn't, but Vincent is rich and connected, and I'm nobody. Who do you think they'll believe? Wade felt that cold, familiar rage building in his chest. The kind that used to send him hunting dangerous men across 3 territories without a second thought. It doesn't matter what they believe, he said. You're staying here. Wade das Seki? No. He said it firmly, cutting off whatever resignation she was about to voice. I don't care if he comes back with a marshal. I don't care if he comes back with a damn army. You're my wife. This is your home, and nobody, Nobody is dragging you back to Philadelphia to pay off some dead man's debts. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. You can't fight the law. Watch me. They'll arrest you. They'll... Let them try. She made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You're insane. Probably. Wade finally gave in to the urge and reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. But I meant what I said. We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Rosalie looked down at their joined hands, and something in her expression shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something fiercer. He called me ungrateful, she said quietly. Difficult. He's a bastard. He said Thomas drank because of me. Because looking at me was... Stop. Wade's voice came out harsher than he meant it to. Stop giving weight to words from men who don't deserve the air they breathe. But what if he's right? What if nothing? Wade moved his free hand to her chin, tilting her face up so she had to look at him. You know what I see when I look at you? Wade. I see someone who took a dying ranch and brought it back to life. Someone who works harder than any 3 men I know. Someone who didn't run when things got hard, who didn't break when winter tried to kill us, who stood beside me in the dark and helped me remember what it felt like to not be alone. He paused, his thumb brushing across her cheek. That's what I see. And if Vincent Crowley can't see it, that says everything about him and nothing about you. Rosalie's tears spilled over then, tracking down her face. I'm so tired of being afraid. I know. I'm tired of men like him making me feel small. Then stop letting them. Wade said it gently but firmly. You're not small, Rosalie. You never were. You just spent so long around people trying to make you believe it that you forgot what you actually are. And what's that? Stronger than every man who ever tried to break you. She looked at him like he'd just handed her something precious and fragile, something she was afraid to hold too tightly in case it shattered. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Wade froze for half a second, shocked by the contact, by the trust it represented. And then his arms came up around her, holding her close while she shook with silent tears. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped together in the doorway, while the spring sun climbed higher and the shadows shifted across the porch. When Rosalie finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear, determined. What do we do? She asked. We prepare, Wade said. If Crowley's coming back with legal papers, we need papers of our own, marriage certificate, anything else that proves you're legally mine. Ours are in order. We filed them in Copper Creek. Good. Then we go to town. We talk to the judge. We make sure everyone knows that you're Rosalie Mercer now, not Rosalie Hartwell, and that any claims Vincent Crowley makes are worthless. And if that's not enough? Wade's expression went hard. Then we make it enough. They rode into Copper Creek the next morning, both of them tense and watchful. The town was bigger than it had been even 6 months ago. New buildings going up, more people on the streets. Growth, progress, all the things that were supposed to make life better but mostly just made it more complicated. Wade tied the horses outside the general store and helped Rosalie down. She was wearing her best dress, dark green, practical but clean, and had her hair pinned up in a way that made her look older, more serious, more like someone you couldn't dismiss. They headed for the judge's office first, a small building near the saloon. Judge Hardigan was an old man, half blind and mostly deaf, but he was honest and he knew the law better than anyone else in 3 counties. He looked up when they entered, his rheumy eyes squinting. Wade Mercer, heard you got married. Yes, sir. This is my wife, Rosalie. Hardigan studied Rosalie with the kind of thorough assessment that made most people squirm, but Rosalie lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily, and after a moment the old man nodded. Pleasure, Mrs. Mercer. What brings you both to my office? Wade laid out the situation, Crowley's visit, the alleged contract, the threats. Hardigan listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Wade finished, the judge sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. You have your marriage certificate? He asked. Rosalie pulled it from her bag and handed it over. Hardigan examined it carefully, then nodded. This is legitimate and properly filed. As far as Wyoming territory is concerned, you're Rosalie Mercer, married to Wade Mercer, with all legal rights and protections that entails. He paused. However, If this Vincent Crowley has documents from Pennsylvania claiming prior obligation, things get complicated. We'd need to see his papers to determine their validity. And if they're fake, Wade asked, then they're worthless. But proving they're fake, Hardigan shrugged. That's the hard part. Rich men can afford convincing forgeries. So what do? You stand your ground. You make it clear that Mrs. Mercer is under your protection and has no intention of honoring any alleged contracts. If Crowley wants to pursue this legally, he'll have to do it through proper channels, which takes time and money. The judge's eyes glinted. And in my experience, men like Crowley prefer easy targets. Make yourself difficult enough, and he might decide it's not worth the effort. It wasn't much comfort, but it was something. They left the judge's office and headed for the general store. Wade needed supplies, and Rosalie wanted to check on fabric for summer dresses. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things married couples did. Except when they walked into the store, the conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward them, and in those eyes Wade saw curiosity, speculation, and something uglier. Judgment. Samuel Brooks was there, leaning against the counter, his smirk firmly in place. Well, if it isn't the happy couple. Wade ignored him and headed for the supplies, but Brooks wasn't the kind of man who took a hint. Heard you had visitors yesterday, Brooks continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. Eastern gentlemen asking about your wife. Something about debts and contracts. He paused, letting the words hang. That true, Mrs. Mercer? You running from something? Rosalie's face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. My past is my own business, Mr. Brooks. Not when it brings trouble to this territory. We don't need Philadelphia problems out here. Then you should probably stop talking to me, Rosalie said quietly, since I'm the one being pursued, not the one doing the pursuing. A few people in the store actually laughed at that. Brooks's smirk faltered. I'm just saying, folks have a right to know if what? Wade's voice cut through the store like a blade. He turned to face Brooks fully, and something in his expression made the other man take a step back. If my wife is legally married to me, if some bastard from back east is trying to extort money with fake papers, if we're going to stand our ground against threats? I didn't mean... Yeah, you did. Wade moved closer, and Brooks's back hit the counter. You meant to make my wife feel unwelcome. You meant to spread gossip and stir up trouble. You meant to make yourself feel important by tearing down someone who never did a damn thing to you. The store had gone silent again, but this time the attention was on Brooks, not Rosalie. So here's what's going to happen, Wade continued, his voice low and dangerous. You're going to apologize to my wife, and then you're going to keep her name out of your mouth unless you've got something respectful to say. Because if I hear you've been spreading rumors or making her life difficult, we're going to have a conversation, and you won't like that conversation. Brooks swallowed hard. For a moment, Wade thought the man might actually stand his ground, might actually force this into something physical. Then Brooks looked at Wade's eyes, really looked, and remembered who he was talking to. My apologies, Mrs. Mercer, Brooks muttered. No offense intended. Rosalie nodded stiffly but didn't respond. Brooks left the store quickly, and the normal sounds of commerce gradually resumed. Wade finished gathering supplies, paid the clerk, and headed outside with Rosalie beside him. They didn't talk until they were on their horses, heading back toward the ranch. You didn't have to do that, Rosalie said finally. Yes, I did. He'll resent you for it. He'll make trouble. Let him try. Wade glanced over at her. I'm done letting people treat you like you don't matter. Done letting them act like you're something to be ashamed of. Wade, no. Listen to me. He pulled his horse to a stop, and she did the same. I know you've spent years being told you're not good enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not whatever enough. And I know words like that leave scars. But you need to understand something. What? Those men, Thomas, Crowley, Brooks, all of them, they're scared of you. Rosalie actually laughed at that. Scared of me? That's ridiculous. Is it? You're smart. You're capable. You don't need them to survive. You prove every day that you can build something, create something, make a life without their approval or their help. And that terrifies men who've built their whole identity on being necessary. He paused, letting that sink in. So they try to make you small, Wade continued. They try to convince you that you're worthless so you'll stay dependent on them. So you'll be grateful for their attention even when they treat you like garbage. Because if you ever figured out that you don't need them, that you never needed them, they'd lose all their power over you. Rosalie stared at him, her eyes wide. I'm not like them, Wade said quietly. I'm not trying to make you need me. I'm trying to make sure you know you don't have to, that you're here because you chose to be, not because you had no other options. I did have no other options, Rosalie pointed out. When I came here, I was desperate. Maybe, but you're not desperate anymore. You've got a home. You've got resources. You've got skills and strength and a hell of a lot more courage than most people I've met. He paused. If you wanted to leave tomorrow, I wouldn't stop you. I'd make sure you had money and supplies and a safe way out, because you deserve to choose your own life. I don't want to leave, Rosalie said softly. Good, because I don't want you to. Wade nudged his horse forward again. But I need you to know you could, that you have that power, because once you know it, men like Crowley stop being quite so scary. They rode in silence for a while, the sun warm on their faces, the grass starting to green up in the fields around them. Then Rosalie said, Thank you. For what? For seeing me as a person instead of a problem. Wade's throat tightened. That's a pretty low bar, Rosalie. Maybe, but you'd be surprised how many men can't clear it. That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become a habit over the winter, this quiet time when they could just exist together without needing to fill the silence with words. But tonight, Wade had something he needed to say. I meant what I told the judge, he said, about protecting you. Whatever Crowley tries, whatever he brings with him, I'm not letting him take you. I know. Even if it means breaking the law, even if it means... Wade! Rosalie reached over and took his hand. I know. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. When you first got here, I thought I was doing you a favor, thought I was being noble or decent or whatever, letting you stay, giving you space, not making demands. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But somewhere along the way, that changed. It's not about being noble anymore. It's not about doing the right thing. Then what is it about? Wade took a breath. It's about the fact that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you slept well. It's about how I find excuses to come back to the house just to hear you singing in the kitchen. It's about how this place stopped feeling like a graveyard and started feeling like home. And the only thing that changed was you. Rosalie had gone very still. I'm not good at this, Wade continued. I'm not good at talking about feelings or being vulnerable or any of the things you're probably supposed to do. But I need you to know that you're not just my wife on paper. You're not just someone I'm protecting because it's the right thing to do. Then what am I? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Wade met her eyes. You're the person I want to wake up next to for the rest of my life. You're the person I want to build something with. You're... He trailed off, searching for the right word. You're home, Rosalie. You're what home feels like. A tear slid down her cheek, but she was smiling. You're not so bad at this after all. I'm terrified, Wade admitted. So am I. But you're still here. So are you. They sat there as darkness fell, hands joined, shoulders touching. And when Rosalie leaned her head against his shoulder, Wade wrapped his arm around her and held on tight. Whatever came next, Crowley, the law, the future, they'd face it together. And that was enough. 3 weeks passed without any sign of Vincent Crowley, and Wade started to think maybe the man had given up. Started to think maybe they'd gotten lucky, that Crowley had decided a woman he clearly despised wasn't worth the trouble of pursuing across half a continent. He should have known better. The fever hit Wade in late April, coming on so fast and hard that he barely made it back to the house before collapsing. 1 minute he was mending fence in the south pasture, sweating in the unseasonable heat, and the next he was shivering so violently his teeth rattled, his vision swimming with black spots. He remembered stumbling through the door, remembered Rosalie's face going white with panic, remembered her hands on his face, cool against skin that felt like it was burning from the inside out. Then everything went dark. When consciousness returned, hours later, days later, he had no idea. Wade found himself in bed, covers piled on top of him despite the fact that he felt like he was being roasted alive. Every muscle ached. His head pounded with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. And when he tried to sit up, the room spun so violently he had to lie back down or risk vomiting. "Don't move!" Rosalie's voice came from somewhere to his left. "You need to rest." Wade turned his head. Even that small movement sent pain lancing through his skull, and found her sitting in a chair beside the bed, her face drawn with exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "How long?" His voice came out as a rasp, his throat raw and painful. 3 days." Rosalie stood and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "The fever broke twice, but it keeps coming back. I've been trying to keep you cool, keep fluids in you." She paused. "I don't know what else to do." Wade closed his eyes against a wave of dizziness. 3 days. 3 days he'd been useless, leaving Rosalie to manage everything alone. "The animals are fine. I'm handling them. The fence can wait." Her voice was firm. "You need to stop worrying about the ranch and focus on not dying." "I'm not dying. You don't know that." The fear in her voice cut through his fever-fogged brain. "This could be typhoid. It could be pneumonia. It could be—" "It's just a fever," Wade said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I've had worse." "When?" "After Shiloh. Spent 2 weeks in a field hospital burning up with infection from a bullet wound. Doctors said I'd be dead by morning." He managed a weak smile. "Disappointed them by lasting till noon." Rosalie didn't smile back. "This isn't a joke, Wade." "I know." "I can't," her voice cracked. "I can't lose you. Not now. Not after—" She stopped, pressing her lips together hard. Wade reached for her hand, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't get to promise that." "I just did." She made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob, then gripped his hand tight. "You're an idiot." "Probably." "Definitely." They sat like that for a while, Wade drifting in and out of awareness while Rosalie kept watch. At some point, she brought him water and made him drink, even though his stomach rebelled at the thought. Later, minutes or hours, time had lost all meaning, she helped him sit up enough to swallow some broth that tasted like nothing but at least stayed down. The fever came and went in waves. Sometimes Wade was lucid enough to hold a conversation. Other times he was lost in fever dreams that mixed the present with the past, turning Rosalie into his mother, the bedroom into a battlefield, the sound of wind into cannon fire. Through it all, Rosalie stayed. She cooled his fever when it spiked. She changed sweat-soaked sheets and helped him drink when he was too weak to hold a cup. She talked to him during the lucid moments and sat in silence during the bad ones, her hand in his, anchoring him to reality when the dreams got too dark. On the 4th day, the fever finally broke for good. Wade woke to find sunlight streaming through the window and his head clear for the first time in what felt like forever. His body felt wrung out, weak as a newborn calf, but the fire under his skin was gone. Rosalie was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted at an angle that had to be killing her neck. She'd pulled a blanket over herself at some point, but it had slipped down to her waist. Her face, even in sleep, looked exhausted. Wade watched her for a long moment, something tight and painful lodging in his chest. She'd stayed with him. For 4 days straight, she'd barely left his side, had run herself into the ground taking care of him when she could have just as easily let him burn through the fever alone. When he'd been hunting bounties, he'd seen men die alone more times than he could count, seen them call out for mothers, wives, anyone who might care enough to sit with them through their last moments. And most of the time, there was no one. But Rosalie had stayed, not because she had to, not because anyone expected it, but because she'd chosen to. Wade must have made some sound because Rosalie's eyes opened, confusion giving way to alertness in an instant. "Wade, how do you feel?" "Like I got trampled by a horse, but better." He tried to sit up and made it about halfway before his arms gave out. "How are the animals?" "I told you, they're fine. I've been managing." "And the garden?" "Also fine." Rosalie stood and helped him sit up properly, propping pillows behind him. "Everything is fine, Wade. You don't need to worry. You look exhausted." "Well, I haven't slept much in 4 days, so yes, I'm tired." She pressed her hand to his forehead, checking for fever. "But you're worth it." The simple statement hit Wade harder than it should have. Rosalie, don't. She cut him off, her voice tight. Don't say it doesn't matter, or that I shouldn't have bothered, or any of the self-deprecating nonsense you're probably about to say. I was going to say thank you. That stopped her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and some of the tension left her shoulders. You're welcome, she said quietly. I mean it. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Rosalie sat back down in the chair, her hands twisting in her lap. Do you know what I realized while you were sick? Wade shook his head. That I couldn't imagine this place without you. That the thought of losing you made me feel like I couldn't breathe. She met his eyes. That somewhere in the past 6 months, you stopped being a stranger I was trying to survive alongside and became someone I can't imagine living without. Wade's throat went tight. Rosalie, I love you. She said it quickly, like she was afraid if she didn't get the words out fast, she'd lose her nerve. I know that's probably not what you want to hear. I know this wasn't supposed to be that kind of marriage, but I need you to know, in case something happens, in case Crowley comes back or the fever comes back or... Wade reached for her hand, cutting off the spiral of words. I love you too. Rosalie froze. What? I love you. It felt strange saying it out loud, strange and terrifying and absolutely true. I think I have for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it. You do? Yeah. Wade pulled her closer, ignoring the way his arms shook with the effort. You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. And these past few days, when I was out of my head with fever, you were the only thing keeping me tethered. Your voice, your hand, knowing you were there. He paused. So yeah, I love you. And I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You're still an idiot. I know, but you're my idiot. Is that a good thing? It's the best thing, she said, and kissed him. It wasn't their first kiss. They'd had a brief, awkward attempt at one after signing the marriage papers in town, but it was the first one that meant something. The first one that came from want instead of obligation. When they pulled apart, Wade was breathing hard, his weakened body protesting the exertion, but he was smiling wider than he had in years. You need to rest, Rosalie said, her voice unsteady. I've been resting for 4 days. Then you need to rest more. She stood, straightening her clothes. I'm going to make you something to eat, something more substantial than broth. Rosalie? She paused at the door. I meant what I said. I love you. Her smile could have lit up the whole territory. I know, I love you too. Wade was still smiling when he fell back asleep, this time into a rest that was peaceful instead of fevered. It took another week before Wade was strong enough to do more than shuffle around the house. Rosalie had been running herself ragged, managing everything alone, and the guilt of that ate at Wade even as he forced himself to rest and rebuild his strength. But by mid-May, he was back on his feet properly, working the ranch again even if he tired more easily than before. The fever had taken something out of him, left him a little weaker, a little more aware of his own mortality. It had also changed things between him and Rosalie. They moved around each other differently now, touched more easily, smiled more often. The careful distance they'd maintained for months had dissolved completely, replaced by a comfort that felt like breathing. Wade still slept in his room and Rosalie in hers, but now when he woke from nightmares, he'd find her standing in his doorway asking if he was all right. And when she couldn't sleep, she'd knock softly on his door and they'd sit together in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking until dawn. They were building something real and solid and worth protecting. Which is why Wade knew, with absolute certainty, that Vincent Crowley would be back. Men like Crowley didn't give up. They didn't accept defeat. They just regrouped and came back with more force, more resources, more determination to win. Wade started preparing. He cleaned and oiled his guns, both the rifle and the Colt he'd stopped wearing months ago. He rode into town and quietly asked around about Crowley, about whether anyone had seen him, heard anything. He reinforced the doors on the house and made sure the windows had proper locks. Rosalie noticed, of course. You think he's coming back, she said one evening as Wade checked the rifle's action for the 3rd time that week. I know he is. When? Soon. Wade set the rifle aside and looked at her. He's had time to get his affairs in order, time to gather whatever he needs, legal papers, hired guns, whatever. And men like him don't forget being humiliated. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been writing letters." Wade frowned. "To who?" "People back in Philadelphia. Women who knew Thomas, knew his family, women who might be willing to testify about what kind of man he was, about the debts he incurred, about whether I had any knowledge of his business dealings." She paused. "And I wrote to the courthouse requesting copies of Thomas's death certificate and estate records. If Crowley claims I owe his family money for debts Thomas incurred, I need proof that those debts existed before Thomas died, and that I had no legal obligation to them." Wade stared at her. That's smart. "I'm not helpless, Wade. I can't shoot a gun or fight off armed men, but I can fight with paper and testimony and evidence." Her jaw set stubbornly. "Crowley wants to use the law against me? Fine. I'll use it right back." Pride swelled in Wade's chest. "Have you heard back from anyone?" 3 letters so far. 2 women willing to testify about Thomas's gambling and drinking, and 1 from the courthouse with partial records. They're sending the full file within a month. "Rosalie, this could change everything." "Maybe. Or maybe Crowley doesn't care about evidence. Maybe he just wants to hurt me for refusing to cooperate." She met Wade's eyes. "But I had to try. I'm tired of running from my past, tired of letting men like him define who I am." Wade crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I'm so damn proud of you." She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I'm scared." "Me too. But we're doing this anyway." "Yeah, we are." They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other until the sun set and darkness claimed the land beyond their windows. Crowley returned on a Tuesday in early June, and this time he brought an army. Wade saw the dust cloud from miles away. Too big to be a single rider, too organized to be random travelers. He counted at least a dozen horses, maybe more, all heading straight for the ranch. "Rosalie!" he called out, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get inside, now!" She was in the garden, her hands dirty from planting tomatoes. She looked up, saw his expression, and immediately dropped her tools and ran for the house. Wade grabbed the rifle and his Colt, checking both weapons with practiced efficiency. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. This was familiar territory, the moments before violence when everything became sharp and clear and simple. Protect what's yours. Survive. Win. The riders crested the rise, and Wade's stomach dropped. It wasn't just Crowley and his men. There was a marshal with them, badge gleaming in the sunlight, legal authority, the law backing Crowley's play. This was bad. The group pulled up in front of the house, horses snorting and stamping. Crowley looked pleased with himself, his smile sharp and triumphant. The marshal, a hard-faced man in his 50s, looked less certain, his eyes taking in Wade's stance, the weapons, the clear readiness for violence. "Mr. Mercer," the marshal said carefully, "I'm Marshal Davies out of Cheyenne. I'm here on official business regarding Mrs. Rosalie Hartwell." "Mercer," Wade corrected. "Her name is Rosalie Mercer." "There's some dispute about that," Crowley interjected, "which is why we're here. I have legal documents proving that Mrs. Hartwell entered into a binding contract 6 months before her alleged marriage to you, documents that make her current marriage invalid." "Then your documents are fake." "The courts will determine that." Crowley's smile widened. "Marshal Davies has a warrant to take Mrs. Hartwell into custody pending a legal hearing to determine the validity of both contracts." Wade's hand tightened on the rifle. "She's not going anywhere." "Mr. Mercer." The marshal's voice carried a warning. "I understand you're protective of your wife, but I have a legal warrant. If you interfere, I'll have to arrest you too. Then you'll have to shoot me, because she's not leaving." The men behind Crowley shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The marshal held up a hand, stopping them. "Nobody needs to get shot today," Davies said, "but the law is the law. If Mrs. Hartwell has a valid defense, she can present it at the hearing, but she needs to come with me." "No." Rosalie's voice came from the doorway. She stepped out onto the porch, her chin lifted, her spine straight. "I'm not going anywhere without seeing these documents first." Crowley's expression flickered with annoyance. "You don't have the right to—" "Actually, she does," Davies interrupted. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out to Rosalie. "These are copies of the contract Mr. Crowley presented to the judge in Cheyenne." Rosalie took the papers with shaking hands. Wade moved to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. The contract was convincing. He had to admit. It looked official, complete with signatures and witness marks and legal language about debt repayment and marital obligation. But the signature at the bottom, allegedly Rosalie's, was wrong. "That's not my signature," Rosalie said quietly. "Of course you'd say that," Crowley sneered. "It's not." She pointed to the signature. "My name is signed Rosalie Ann Hartwell. My middle name is Elizabeth, not Ann, and I always sign with my full middle name." She looked at the marshal. "You can verify this with our marriage certificate and with any other document I've signed in Wyoming." Davies frowned, his certainty wavering. That's something the judge will need to examine." "I also have letters," Rosalie continued, her voice growing stronger, "from women in Philadelphia who knew my husband, knew his debts. Women willing to testify that I had no knowledge of his business dealings and no legal obligation to his family's claims." She reached into her pocket and pulled out folded papers. "And I have estate records showing that Thomas Hartwell died with no assets and significant gambling debts, none of which were my responsibility under Pennsylvania law." Crowley's face went red. "Those are lies. They're courthouse records," Rosalie snapped. "Official documents, unlike your forged contract." "You have no proof it's forged." "The signature is wrong. The witnesses listed don't exist. I checked, and the debt amount claimed doesn't match any of Thomas's actual creditors." Rosalie stepped forward, and Crowley actually backed up. "You tried to extort money from a widow who had nothing. And when I refused to cooperate, you followed me across the country to harass and threaten me. That's not legal action, Mr. Crowley. That's criminal." The marshal was looking at Crowley now with open suspicion. "Mr. Crowley, if these documents are fraudulent—" "They're not fraudulent. That woman is a liar and a—" "Careful." Wade's voice cut through Crowley's tirade like a knife. "Finish that sentence, and I'll put a bullet through your teeth." Crowley went pale. Davies stepped between them, his hand on his gun. Everyone calmed down. "Mr. Crowley, I'm going to need you to come with me back to Cheyenne. The judge will want to examine these documents more closely, and if they are forgeries, you'll be facing charges." "This is ridiculous. I have rights." "So does Mrs. Mercer." Davies turned to Rosalie. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. Based on what you've shown me, I don't believe there's sufficient cause to remove you from your home, but I will need you to appear at a hearing in 2 weeks to present your evidence formally." Rosalie nodded. "I'll be there." Crowley looked like he wanted to argue more, but the marshal's expression made it clear that wasn't an option. With visible reluctance, Crowley mounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said, looking at Rosalie with pure hatred. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll see you destroyed for this." "Get off my land," Wade said quietly, "before I decide the law can sort out your corpse." The threat wasn't empty, and everyone there knew it. Crowley rode off with the marshal and most of the men. But 3 riders stayed behind, lingering at the edge of the property. Wade watched them with growing unease. "Those aren't lawmen." "No," Rosalie agreed. "Those are hired guns." The men didn't approach, didn't make any threatening moves. They just sat on their horses, watching the house, making their presence known. A message. Crowley might have lost the legal battle, but he wasn't done fighting. That night, Wade didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen with the rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows. The hired guns had made camp about a quarter-mile from the house, close enough to be a threat, far enough to claim they weren't trespassing. Rosalie came downstairs around midnight, wrapped in a shawl. "You should be sleeping," Wade said. "So should you." She sat down across from him. "They're not going to attack tonight. It's too obvious." "Maybe." "Crowley's not stupid. He knows if something happens to me now, right after the marshal left, he'll be the first suspect." She paused. "He's trying to scare us, make us panic." "Is it working?" "Terrified," Rosalie admitted. "But I'm not running." Wade reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll go to that hearing. We'll present your evidence, and we'll end this. And if the judge rules against me anyway, if Crowley bribed him, or if the evidence isn't enough, then we leave. We take what we can carry, and we disappear. Wyoming's a big territory." "Wait, this is your home, your mother's home. I can't ask you to—" "You're my home now," Wade interrupted. "The ranch is just wood and land. You're what matters." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you. That's the stupidest thing you've ever said. She laughed wetly. Maybe. They sat together through the long night, hands joined across the table, while outside the hired guns kept their vigil and the darkness pressed close. Morning came with no violence, but also no relief. The hired guns were still there, still watching. Wade did his chores with one eye always on the horizon. Rosalie worked in the house, jumping at every unexpected sound. The next week crawled by in tense, watchful silence. The hired guns didn't leave, didn't attack, just watched. Wade recognized the tactic. It was psychological warfare, keep the target on edge, stressed, waiting for violence that might never come. Eventually, people in that state made mistakes, got careless, gave their enemies an opening. But Wade had experience with this kind of pressure, had used it himself when hunting bounties. He wasn't going to break, and neither was Rosalie. They prepared for the hearing methodically, gathering every piece of evidence, every letter, every document that proved Rosalie's case. She practiced her testimony with Wade, going over every detail until she could recite it without hesitation. They were ready, or as ready as they could be, facing a system that didn't always care about truth as much as it cared about money and influence. The night before they were supposed to leave for Cheyenne, Rosalie couldn't sleep. Wade found her sitting on the porch in the darkness, staring out at the hired gun's distant campfire. What if it's not enough? She asked quietly. Wade sat down beside her. Then we tried, and we'll figure out what comes next. I'm so tired of fighting. I know. I just want to live. I just want to wake up in the morning and not be afraid. She turned to look at him. Is that too much to ask? No, Wade said. It's not, and we're going to get there. I promise. You can't promise that. Watch me. Rosalie leaned against him, and Wade wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close while the stars wheeled overhead and the distant campfire burned low. Tomorrow they'd ride to Cheyenne. Tomorrow they'd face Crowley and the law and whatever came next. But tonight they had this. They had each other. And sometimes that was enough to keep going. They never made it to Cheyenne. The attack came at dawn, 3 days before the scheduled hearing. Wade woke to the sound of breaking glass and was on his feet with the Colt in his hand before his mind fully caught up with his body. The window in the front room had shattered inward, and through it he could see movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Men on horseback, torches burning, circling the house like wolves around wounded prey. Rosalie! Wade shouted, already moving toward her room. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale, but composed. How many? At least 6, maybe more. Wade handed her the smaller pistol he'd been teaching her to shoot over the past week. Stay away from the windows. If anyone gets inside, I know what to do. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, and the kitchen window exploded. Wade dropped low, pulling Rosalie down with him as bullets tore through the house, splintering wood and shattering what was left of the glass. This wasn't a warning, this was an execution. Crowley had decided if he couldn't have Rosalie, nobody would. Wade Army crawled to the front window and risked a quick look outside. 7 riders, all armed, all firing at the house with methodical precision. And there, standing back from the chaos, watching from horseback, was Vincent Crowley himself, his face illuminated by torchlight and twisted with satisfaction. You son of a bitch, Wade muttered. Another volley of gunfire tore through the house. One bullet passed so close to Wade's head he felt the displacement of air. He returned fire through the broken window, and one of the riders jerked backward in his saddle before sliding to the ground. 6 left. The odds were still terrible. Wade! Rosalie's voice came from the kitchen, sharp with fear. The barn's on fire! Wade's heart sank. The barn meant the horses, the feed, everything they'd need if they had to run. Crowley wasn't just trying to kill them. He was trying to destroy any chance they had of escaping. Smart, vicious. Exactly what Wade would have done if their positions were reversed. Stay inside, Wade ordered. He reloaded quickly, his hands moving with muscle memory older than thought. Keep shooting if they get close. Aim for center mass, don't try for headshots. Where are you going? To end this. Before Rosalie could argue, Wade kicked open the back door and rolled out into the yard. Bullets kicked up dirt around him as the riders adjusted their aim, but Wade was already moving, using the well pump for cover as he returned fire. 2 more shots. 2 more riders down. 4 left, plus Crowley. The remaining hired guns had figured out Wade was the real threat and were converging on his position. Wade dropped behind the pump as bullets ricocheted off the metal, the sound deafening in the morning air. He was pinned down, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. This was how it would end then. Not old and peaceful in his bed, but the way he'd always half expected, violent and sudden and alone in the dirt. Except he wasn't alone. The kitchen window exploded outward as Rosalie opened fire, her shots wild but effective enough to scatter the riders and give Wade breathing room. He used the distraction to move, sprinting toward the corner of the house where he'd have a better angle. One of the riders caught the movement and spurred his horse forward, weapon raised. Wade fired first. The man toppled from his saddle and his horse bolted in panic. 3 left. But Wade's Colt was empty now and the rifle was still inside the house. He had his knife, always had his knife, but bringing a blade to a gunfight was suicide. The remaining riders seemed to realize this at the same time Wade did. They advanced slowly, weapons trained on him, confident in their victory. Wade stood his ground, knife in hand, and waited for the end. Then Rosalie stepped out onto the porch. "Stop!" Her voice rang out across the yard, clear and commanding. She held the pistol in both hands, pointed directly at Vincent Crowley. "Tell them to stop or I'll shoot you where you sit." Crowley laughed. "You don't have the courage." Rosalie adjusted her aim and fired. The bullet passed within inches of Crowley's head, close enough that his horse reared in panic. When she spoke again, her voice was ice. "The next one goes through your skull. Call them off." Crowley's amusement died. He looked at Rosalie like he was seeing her for the first time, not as the frightened widow he'd bullied back in Philadelphia, but as someone who'd learned to fight back. "You're making a mistake, Rosalie," he said. "No. You made the mistake. You thought I was still the woman you could push around. You thought I'd just accept whatever you decided." Rosalie's hands didn't shake. "But that woman is gone, and the woman standing here will put a bullet in you without losing a second of sleep." Wade believed her. More importantly, so did Crowley. "Stand down," Crowley ordered his men. "Lower your weapons." The hired guns hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. They'd been paid to kill, not to negotiate. "I said stand down." Crowley's voice cracked with fear now. Slowly, reluctantly, the guns lowered. Wade used the moment to retrieve his rifle from inside, reloading it with quick, efficient movements. When he stepped back outside, the balance of power had shifted. 3 hired guns, all uncertain and looking for a way out. Crowley trapped between his arrogance and his survival instinct. And Wade and Rosalie, both armed, both absolutely done with this entire situation. "Here's what's going to happen," Wade said quietly. "You're going to turn around and ride away, all of you. And you're never coming back." "You can't, Crowley started. "I can." Wade's voice dropped to something cold and final. "You came to my home. You tried to kill my wife. You burned my barn. The law's not going to help you now, Crowley. This is frontier justice, and out here, I'm the law. Marshal Davies will find your body and rule it self-defense, if he finds it at all. This is a big territory, and bodies have a way of disappearing out here." Wade raised the rifle slightly. "So you've got a choice. Ride away now and live, or stay and die. I don't particularly care which." Crowley's face went from red to pale. "This is murder. This is survival." Wade's finger moved to the trigger. "And I'm done talking." For a long frozen moment, nobody moved. Then one of the hired guns broke the standoff. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered, turning his horse. "You want to get yourself killed over some woman? That's your business. But I'm not dying for your pride." The other 2 followed quickly, spurring their horses toward the horizon without looking back. Crowley sat alone on his horse, abandoned by the men he'd paid, facing 2 people who had every reason to kill him and nothing left to lose. "Go," Rosalie said quietly, "before I change my mind about letting you live." Crowley opened his mouth, maybe to threaten, maybe to plead, but whatever he saw in their faces made the words die unspoken. He turned his horse and rode away, faster than dignified, leaving Wade and Rosalie standing in the ruins of their yard as the sun finally broke over the horizon. Wade watched until Crowley disappeared from sight. Then he lowered the rifle and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Is it over? Rosalie asked, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Yeah. Wade turned to look at her. It's over. Rosalie's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers. I almost shot him. I almost actually... But you didn't. Wade sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You scared him enough to make him leave. That took more courage than pulling the trigger would have. I don't feel courageous. I feel like I'm going to be sick. That's normal. First time holding someone's life in your hands is always the hardest. Wade gently took the pistol and made it safe. You did good, Rosalie. Real good. They sat together in the growing light, surveying the damage. The house was riddled with bullet holes. Every window was broken. The barn was a smoking ruin, though thankfully the horses had been in the pasture and had escaped. The garden was trampled. The well pump had 3 bullet holes in it. It was a disaster. But they were alive. And Crowley was gone. What now? Rosalie asked eventually. Wade looked at the destroyed house, then at the woman beside him. This woman who'd survived an abusive marriage, crossed half a continent alone, rebuilt a dying ranch, and just faced down armed men without flinching. Now we rebuild, he said. Again. Rosalie started laughing. It was slightly hysterical, edged with exhaustion and shock, but genuine. We just keep rebuilding, don't we? The house, the barn, ourselves? Yeah. Wade found himself smiling despite everything. I guess we do. I'm tired of rebuilding. Me too. But we're going to do it anyway. Yeah, we are. Rosalie leaned against him, and Wade wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They sat like that as the sun climbed higher, warming the destruction around them, and Wade realized something important. They'd survived. Not because they were perfect, or prepared, or even particularly lucky, but because they'd refused to break, refused to let men like Crowley define their worth or determine their future. That mattered. That meant something. The next weeks were a blur of hard work and slow recovery. The town rallied in ways Wade hadn't expected. Turns out watching a woman face down armed attackers earned respect in Wyoming, even from people who'd been ready to judge her before. Samuel Brooks showed up with lumber. The blacksmith came out to help with the barn. Even Judge Hardigan rode out personally to take their statements and make it clear that if Vincent Crowley ever set foot in the territory again, there'd be a warrant waiting for him. Rosalie threw herself into the rebuilding with fierce determination. She worked alongside Wade from dawn to dusk, hauling boards, hammering nails, refusing to let the destruction defeat her. And one evening in late July, as they stood back to admire the new barn, smaller than the old one but solid and well built, Rosalie turned to Wade with a strange expression. I need to tell you something, she said. Wade's stomach clenched. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it is. She took a breath. I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop. Wade stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. You're... what? Pregnant. About 3 months, I think. Maybe 4. Rosalie's hands twisted together nervously. I wasn't sure at first, but now I am. And I know this wasn't planned, and we're still rebuilding, and the timing is terrible, but Wade kissed her. It was sudden and impulsive, and probably not the smooth romantic gesture the moment called for, but it was all he could think to do with the overwhelming surge of emotion that hit him. When they pulled apart, Rosalie was crying and smiling at the same time. So you're not upset? She asked. Upset? Rosalie, Wade couldn't find the words, couldn't express the strange mix of terror and joy and fierce protective love that was flooding through him. I'm going to be a father. Yeah. We're going to have a baby. Yes. Here, on this ranch. Our baby. Rosalie laughed through her tears. That's generally how it works. Wade pulled her close, holding her like she was made of glass and gold and every precious thing he'd ever feared losing. A baby. Their baby. Proof that they'd built something that would outlast them, that would carry forward into a future neither of them had dared imagine 6 months ago. I love you, he said into her hair. I love you so damn much. I love you too. Rosalie's arms tightened around him. Even though you're terrible at expressing emotions and you sleep with a knife under your pillow and you once told me the coffee I made was adequate. It was adequate. That wasn't an insult. Wade, if you tell our child their accomplishments are adequate, I'm divorcing you. Noted. They stood together in the fading light, wrapped in each other, while around them the ranch slowly healed and the future stretched out full of possibility. The baby came in February, during another Wyoming blizzard, because apparently that's just how their life worked now. The midwife from town barely made it through the snow in time, and Wade spent the entire labor pacing holes in the floor downstairs while Rosalie's screams echoed through the house. It was the longest night of Wade's life. When the crying finally started, not Rosalie's cries of pain, but the thin, fierce wail of new life, Wade nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife came down an hour later, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Mercer, and your wife is tired but healthy. You can go up now." Wade took the stairs 3 at a time. Rosalie was propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. And in her arms, wrapped in a quilt his mother had made years ago, was a tiny red-faced baby with a shocking amount of dark hair. "Come meet your son," Rosalie said softly. Wade approached slowly, almost afraid. He'd held guns and reins and ropes and knives. He'd never held something this small, this fragile, this absolutely terrifying. "Support his head," Rosalie instructed, guiding Wade's arms into position. "There. You've got him." Wade looked down at his son, and felt something in his chest break open. All the walls he'd built, all the armor he'd worn, all the distance he'd kept between himself and the world, it all crumbled. "He's so small," Wade whispered. "He'll grow. What if I mess this up? What if I'm not—" "You'll be fine," Rosalie's voice was firm. "You'll make mistakes. We both will. But we'll figure it out together." The baby made a small sound, his tiny hand reaching out and somehow finding Wade's finger, gripping it with surprising strength. And Wade, the man who'd seen war and death and violence enough for 10 lifetimes, started crying. "I don't deserve this," he managed. "Maybe not." Rosalie reached up and wiped his tears. "But you have it anyway. That's called grace, Wade. That's called second chances. That's called building something good out of broken pieces." Wade carefully handed the baby back to Rosalie and sat on the edge of the bed, watching them both. His wife, his son, his family. A year ago, he'd been alone in a dying house, slowly drinking himself to death with grief and regret. Now he had this. Had them. Had a future that looked nothing like his past. "What should we name him?" Rosalie asked. Wade thought about it. Thought about his father, who died when Wade was 12. Thought about his mother, who'd loved him even when he was unlovable. Thought about all the people who'd shaped him into someone capable of this moment. "Thomas," he said finally. Rosalie looked up sharply. No. After your capacity to forgive, to take something terrible and make something good from it." Wade met her eyes. "Your first husband was a bastard who didn't deserve you, but you survived him. You became stronger because of that survival, and I want our son to have that strength, that resilience, that refusal to let the past define the future." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears again. That's actually perfect." "Thomas Mercer," Wade said, testing the name. "What do you think?" The baby yawned, utterly unimpressed with the whole discussion. "I think he approves," Rosalie said, smiling. Wade leaned down and kissed them both, first Rosalie, then the baby's forehead, so soft and warm and impossibly vulnerable. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up. For staying. For choosing this." Wade gestured around the room, at the house they'd rebuilt, at the life they'd created from nothing. "For choosing me." "You chose me too," Rosalie pointed out, "that first day. You could have sent me away, but you didn't. You gave me space and safety and time to heal. You taught me that not all men are cruel, that love doesn't have to hurt." She paused. "So thank you for seeing me, for all of it." They sat together as the blizzard raged outside and the baby slept between them, and Wade thought about how strange life was. How you could spend years running from yourself only to find that what you were really running toward was home. How you could be so broken you thought you'd never be whole again, only to discover that wholeness wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest and present and willing to try. He'd been a soldier, a bounty hunter, a killer. A man who'd carried more guilt than hope for longer than he wanted to remember. But now he was a husband, a father, A man who'd learned that the bravest thing you could do wasn't surviving violence. It was opening yourself up to love even when you were terrified it would destroy you. Spring came eventually, the way it always did in Wyoming, slowly, reluctantly, but with gathering force. The snow melted, the grass greened, the garden that Rosalie had planted with such fierce determination began to sprout. Thomas grew from a tiny, helpless thing into a baby who smiled and cooed and grabbed at everything within reach. Wade discovered that he was actually pretty good at this father thing, patient in ways he'd never been before, gentle in ways that surprised even him. And the ranch thrived. Word had spread about the attack, about how Rosalie and Wade had stood their ground against armed men and won. People respected that, respected them. The ranch started getting visitors, traveling families who needed a place to rest, settlers looking for advice on surviving their first Wyoming winter, even the occasional drifter who just wanted a hot meal and a warm barn to sleep in. Wade and Rosalie never turned anyone away. They understood what it meant to be desperate and alone, understood what it meant to need help and not know where to find it. So they shared what they had: food, shelter, knowledge, kindness, and slowly, imperceptibly, the ranch stopped being just a place they lived and became a home that mattered, a refuge, a proof that broken people could build something lasting if they were willing to work for it. One evening, in late summer, after Thomas was asleep and the chores were done, Wade and Rosalie sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their tradition, this quiet time when they could just be together without needing to be anything else. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't come here?" Rosalie asked. Wade considered the question. "Sometimes, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and my brain decides to torture me." "What do you think would have happened?" "I'd probably be dead." Wade said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "We're close enough that it wouldn't matter. I was giving up before you got here. Slowly, but definitely. And I'd probably be trapped in Philadelphia, being reminded daily that I was worthless and unwanted." Rosalie leaned against him. "Strange how we saved each other without meaning to." "Is that what we did?" "Isn't it?" She looked up at him. "You gave me a place to belong. I gave you a reason to keep living. That sounds like saving to me." Wade thought about that. About the woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach 6 months ago, terrified and resigned and expecting the worst. About the man he'd been back then, alone, angry, drowning in guilt and grief. They'd both been so broken, and somehow, impossibly, they'd helped each other heal. "I don't think that's the whole story," Wade said slowly. "I think we saved ourselves, but we did it together, and that made all the difference." Rosalie smiled. "I like that better." "Yeah? Yeah, it's more honest. Less romantic, maybe, but more true." She paused. "We're not a fairy tale, Wade. We're two damaged people who found each other and decided to try. And some days are beautiful and some days are hard and most days are just normal. But it's ours. We built it. Nobody gave it to us." Wade pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, soap and sunshine and home. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I'm glad I stayed." They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Inside the house, their son slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch they'd rebuilt stood solid and strong, and ahead of them stretched a future full of uncertainty and possibility and all the messy, complicated beauty of a life lived honestly. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was more than enough. Years would pass. Thomas would grow into a strong, kind boy who had his mother's intelligence and his father's quiet strength. The ranch would expand. More children would come. 2 daughters who would learn from their mother that their worth wasn't defined by what men thought of them, and from their father that strength meant protecting what you loved, not proving you were stronger than everyone else. Wade would teach his children to ride and shoot and survive on the frontier. Rosalie would teach them to read and think and question the world around them. Together, they'd raise a family that understood hardship but chose kindness anyway. The town would grow around them, and Rosalie would eventually start teaching other children alongside her own, first just a few, then a dozen, then enough that they'd build a proper schoolhouse. She'd become known throughout the territory not as someone's wife or someone's victim, but as the woman who'd taught a generation of frontier children that education was power and knowledge was freedom. Wade would put away his guns eventually, Not from shame or regret, but because he simply didn't need them anymore. The violence that had defined so much of his life would fade into the past, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of building something instead of destroying it. They'd grow old together, these two broken people who'd found each other by accident and stayed by choice. They'd have arguments and hard times and moments when they wanted to scream at each other or the universe or both. Because love wasn't some magical cure that fixed everything. It was a choice you made every day to keep trying, keep building, keep showing up even when it was hard. But they'd also have laughter and warmth and countless small moments of grace. Mornings drinking coffee together, evenings on the porch watching their children play, nights wrapped in each other's arms, drawing strength from the simple fact of not being alone. And when Wade was old, truly old, weathered by time instead of just violence, he'd sit on that same porch with Rosalie beside him, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the grass, and he'd think about that day so many years ago when a stagecoach had arrived, carrying a woman nobody wanted. The woman nobody wanted had become the very soul of his home, the foundation of his family. The proof that worth wasn't something other people gave you. It was something you claimed for yourself by refusing to accept the limitations they tried to impose. Rosalie had been called worthless, difficult, unwanted. She'd been dismissed and mocked and told she took up too much space just by existing, and she'd proved every single one of those voices wrong. Not by becoming smaller or quieter or more acceptable, but by refusing to disappear, by taking up space unapologetically, by building a life so full and rich and meaningful that anyone who'd ever underestimated her would have to reckon with the fact that they'd been blind. That was the real victory, Wade understood. Not defeating Vincent Crowley, or surviving the frontier, or even building a successful ranch. The victory was in Rosalie waking up every morning and choosing to exist fully, completely, without apology or shame. And in Wade learning that his past didn't define his future. That killing men didn't make him a monster. It made him someone who'd done terrible things and survived them, and somehow found his way back to something resembling peace. They were both imperfect, both scarred, both carrying damage that would never fully heal, but they'd learned to carry it together, to share the weight, to build something good despite the broken pieces they'd started with. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not perfection, not some fairy tale ending where everything was fixed and everyone lived happily ever after without struggle or pain. Just two people who'd refused to give up, on themselves, on each other, on the possibility that even in a hard world, you could still carve out spaces of warmth and safety and love. The sun set over the Wyoming plains, and Wade Mercer, former soldier, bounty hunter, killer, husband, father, held his wife's hand and watched the sky turn gold. He'd spent so many years running from himself. But here, now, with Rosalie beside him, and their family safe inside the home they'd built together, Wade finally understood what it meant to stop running. It meant accepting that you were flawed and damaged and probably always would be. It meant showing up anyway. It meant choosing love even when it terrified you, choosing connection even when isolation felt safer, choosing to build even when destruction was easier. It meant learning that the opposite of broken wasn't perfect. It was whole. And wholeness came from embracing every part of yourself, even the parts you wished you could erase. Rosalie squeezed his hand and Wade squeezed back. They'd made it. Against all odds, through all the darkness and violence and fear, they'd made it to the other side. Not unscathed, but together. And in the gathering twilight of a Wyoming evening, with the wind whispering through the grass and the stars beginning to emerge overhead, that was more than enough. It was everything.